quite last minute, but it turned into a pretty amazing journey that took me to Montgomery and Birmingham, Alabama, to Warsaw, to Auschwitz, to Krakow, all in Poland, to Prague, to Berlin, to Theresienstadt. And in all of those places, I had some very profound encounters and meetings. And the trip became sort of a homage to two very beloved Holocaust survivors who were part of the Jewish community here in Boulder. Specifically, they were both members of my community, B'nai Shalom. Irene Rosenshine, who some of you I probably had an opportunity to meet, who was herself in Auschwitz. And she actually has her second yahrzeit, the second anniversary of her death on the English calendar was a few days ago, last week, and on the Jewish calendar is next week. So we actually at B'nai Shalom were doing something where we're showing a film that was originally going to be shown as part of the Boulder Jewish Film Festival, a film of her life and a discussion about her and her legacy. That's next Tuesday evening. But and then Doris Small, who grew up in Berlin and was on the Kindertransport to London, and she was also a member here. And they both died in 2018. And so in the end, my trip became a sort of like a homage to the two of them, who I developed close relationships to, and so part of the journey is sort of dedicated to them, really. So with that, I think I'll begin. As Joy said, please, if you have questions throughout, I'm trying to work out the best place to put the camera, maybe that's better. If you have questions, do feel free to write in the chat. I think let's not interrupt the flow through conversation, if that's okay, but if we want to have some conversation at the end, depending on the time, we can do that. Oh, one more thing to say is that parts of this journey really inspired some writing for me. So the images are interspersed with some spoken word that I'll be reciting that came out of the experience. I mean, all of the pieces I'll be sharing were written in the places where I was. So one was written in Montgomery, Alabama. Oh, my mother's here from London. Shall I let her in? I guess so. So all of the pieces that I'll be sharing, the reading pieces were written in location. So one of them was written in Montgomery, Alabama. One of them was written on a train between Warsaw and Krakow. A couple of them were written while I was actually in Auschwitz-Birkenau. One of them was written, a couple of them actually written in Krakow, so you'll hear those kind of interspersed with the story as I start it. So with that, I will share my screen and hopefully it'll work. It's always such a, can everybody see that?
Yes, Marc, it does have both images on.
It does?
It does.
I don't understand it. I'm going to try and fix that because we had fixed it before. Where display? What about that?
It's still the same.
We got it going, right?
We did.
Okay. I'm sorry. This is frustrating. I'm going to try and start again.
I've been on lots of Zoom calls also, and it continues to be a delightful way to engage with things that come up every time. So I appreciate all of your patience, and please take your time, Marc.
What do you see now? Same?
Same screen, but
I don't understand it. We had it we had it all figured out.
I'm
And that?
same.
Because it says I'm swapping the presenter view and the slideshow, so now?
Mm-hmm.
All right, well, it is what it is. But you can see the biggest image is the one that says from Alabama to Auschwitz, right?
Yes.
Okay, all right. I'm just going to go with it. I'm sorry, it's imperfect like everything else in our world. I do want to say, because I see Professor Shankman on the call, that I'm by no means a Holocaust scholar in any way, and this is just a reflection. Thank you for being here, by the way. This is just a really like a personal journey, this whole story, really. I went with a group of rabbis through TRUA, which was formerly Rabbis for Human Rights of North America, on a very, very profound trip to Montgomery, Alabama, where we went to the Legacy Museum, which is a relatively new museum that was actually founded by EJI, which is the Equal Justice Initiative, which was the foundation. Some of you maybe saw the film Just Mercy. Brian Stevenson, a very, very, very powerful African-American civil rights lawyer who has tirelessly fought for justice, especially for black men on death row throughout the state of Alabama, but not just there. And the Legacy Museum was founded in an old slave warehouse where the slaves would literally just be you know, in some cases just chained up in this bare warehouse until they went to the square for auction. And it was a very powerful experience for me, not growing up in North America and not really fully understanding the impact of the history of slavery, of lynchings, of segregation and mass incarceration. And the subtitle, as you can see on the slide of the museum, is From Slavery to Mass Incarceration, because the narrative arc of the museum is that slavery never really stopped. It just transformed into something else. In the museum, there are some very, very powerful exhibits. It's a very, very incredibly placed museum, and I think everybody should go if they have the opportunity. But there are, when you first walk in, there are these sort of holograms of people singing and speaking, some of them sort of in cages representing their cells. And there was one that really touched me, which was of a big black woman who was a slave, who was singing with that very rich voice that we sometimes associate the spiritual practices and traditions of slaves, who was singing. And her song was, "This may be the last time you'll hear me singing, Lord." And it really struck me, and I wrote a little piece about it, which I'm going to share now. "I'm haunted still by the image of the woman who sings with such fullness of soul and breaking of heart. This may be the last time you will hear me singing, Lord, I don't know. This may be the last time you will hear me singing, Lord, I don't know. Her song is rich and it penetrates with its continued faith in the face of such brutality and pain and loss and fear, a trembling and anguish I will, God willing, never know. And yet her song is the song of countless millions who have been and are still dehumanized in ways too painful to imagine. And yet she sings, and her song echoes into the earth, blooded by brutal barbarism, and into the heavens where it is translated into the most sublime prayers. Next to her two children in a cage, next to her two children in a cage ask, have you seen our mama? Have you seen our mama? Inhumanity separated families in the past and continues to separate them in the present, opening the wounds of those old memories and ensuring that they are not confined to history. The song remains." About a quarter of a mile down the street, sorry, let's put it all back, what I was feeling in that moment. About a quarter of a mile down the street from the Legacy Museum is the Peace and Justice Memorial, which, and it was here where I really decided that I was going to go to Berlin in the same year, because this memorial was inspired by the Holocaust Museum in Berlin, actually. and each of the slabs here, these concrete slabs, are a memorial to the 4,400 lynchings that happened between 1877 and 1950. And each of these slabs has a county throughout the US where people were lynched. And we know that it was not just in the South, it was all over this country. And that the names of the people who were lynched and the counties where they were and the dates and the quote unquote crime which they committed, which caused their lynching, which was normally something like speaking to a white woman. And it was incredibly moving to walk through, and it's again, I just hope you'll get to see it. It's a very powerful place and very powerful memorial. And then this sculpture that was created by Dana King, which was dedicated to the women who sustained the Montgomery boycott. And then just down in the center of the town of Montgomery is the bus stop, where, as you can see, on December 1st, 1955, Rosa Parks boarded the bus, and that became such an important part of history. Right across from that, there's this sign which shows you all of the warehouses, and there were a lot of warehouses right through the main street of Montgomery where the slaves were kept until they went to auction, as I said earlier. And then you can see this is also in an old slave warehouse is the offices of EJI, the Equal Justice Initiative, founded by the lawyer Bryan Stevenson, who I mentioned. If you haven't seen it, I mean, I'm sure by now it's on Netflix or wherever else, but the film that just came out earlier this year, Just Mercy, which tells the story of Bryan Stevenson and the formation of the Equal Justice Initiative. We got an opportunity as a group of rabbis to meet the lawyers who worked there, and it was very, very powerful experience. I drove from in a rental car. The group we were just in Montgomery. I actually went from there to Birmingham, and the relatively short drive from Montgomery to Birmingham, and then I spent a day touring around the civil rights sites in Birmingham and the Kelly Ingram Park in the middle of Birmingham, and I cut a lot of these slides out because we're just not going to have time, but there's a lot of different sculptures, but this particular one is a memorial to the 4 girls who were the victims of the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing, which is right across from the square, and there it is. It was in September 1963, and there was that horrible bombing where those 4 girls were killed, and that's the inside of the church. And then I actually spent Shabbat in Birmingham. I was a guest rabbi in Temple Beth El, which is a very old congregation, founded in 1907. And you can see the exterior and the interior of the synagogue there. It's the conservative synagogue in Birmingham. And what a lot of people don't know is that in 1958, there were 54 sticks of dynamite that were placed outside this synagogue. They were within the law enforcement thought they were within a minute of going off when the fuse went out because it started to rain, and the FBI afterwards said that much dynamite would have completely obliterated the shul. It was the same white supremacist group, not the KKK, but the same white supremacist group that I think that were behind the 16th Street Baptist bombing. But there was this just extraordinary shared history of violence and hatred in the South, which unfortunately we see raising its ugly head even now during coronavirus, where we hear of white supremacists who've been trying to get hold of the virus in liquid form and put it on synagogues. And we've seen synagogues in the South being vandalized with hateful graffiti. And so those two histories go on. Some of you may have got to meet Solomon Kimmerling, who's living here in Boulder right now. He's the son of Leslie Kimmerling, who's the partner of Butch Weaver, lives up the street from here. They're active members of B'nai Shalom. He grew up 3rd generation in Birmingham, Alabama. He's in his 80s now. And this was the synagogue that he grew up in. And I stayed with him and had him as my guide. And he has incredible stories about the Jewish involvement in the civil rights movement. So I'm going to make a very quick switch from Alabama to Warsaw, and this first picture, which you've already seen because the way the screen sharing is working, but my oldest childhood friend someone called Jonathan Glaser is a filmmaker, quite a well-known filmmaker in England, and he is, I mean, it's, I'm sure, all on hold now because of the virus, but he is making a film about Auschwitz. And so when I was going to Poland, he set me up with all of the contacts, and this guy Bartek is actually a film producer who lives half the time in LA and half the time in Warsaw. And he met me the night I arrived in Warsaw, and was just an amazing guide. And he was the first of many non-Jewish Poles who I met who were absolutely just so craving to know Jewish people. And it's part of the story, part of my experience of the story, how whatever our narratives may be about the Poles, the reality is that a third of the population of Poland before the war were Jewish. And in some cases, there was a lot of long established integration. And while it's true that many Poles were absolutely complicit and vile and full of hatred towards the Jews, there were many who were very traumatized by the losses. And there's tons of stories like that. And Bartek actually only recently discovered that one of his grandfathers was Jewish, and he'd never known that. And now he is the main Polish guy for this film about Auschwitz. And he told me that he's at this point visited Auschwitz 120 something times. And he said each time he goes there, a piece of him dies and he feels physically sick. And it's been incredibly traumatic for him, but it's like he has got this mission to help my friend Jonathan make the film about Auschwitz. So we also had a lot of fun. We felt like we were brothers by the end of it. He took me around and introduced me to some nice bars, and we saw a bit of Warsaw culture. I spent 2 days in Warsaw. I went the first morning I was there, which was actually the morning of the election where Governor Jared Polis and Attorney General Phil Weiser both got elected as our Attorney General and as our governor. And it was early that morning as the results were coming through. And I got the results, and I actually emailed both Jared Polis and Phil Weiser, both of whom I have something of a relationship with, and just said, I'm in Warsaw. As some of you know, Phil Weiser's whole story, his mother was actually born in a concentration camp. And it's a big part of his story for justice is his own connection to the Holocaust. So I emailed him and said, Mazel Tov, I'm so happy you got elected. And I'm in Warsaw, and I'm about to get on a train and go to Auschwitz. And he wrote back straight away. I think he was quite moved to get that email, even though he was celebrating his election victory. But that same morning, I went to this synagogue in the Nozick Synagogue, which is the one of the few active synagogues. And I actually went in there and prayed Shacharit, the morning service there. And I was, at the front of the shul was Rabbi Michael Joseph Shudrich, who's actually, can someone who's, mute, there's some background noise if I think someone's unmuted. There was, I had the most amazing conversation. I had breakfast with the chief rabbi of Poland, which, just happened to be because I went to that synagogue that morning. And he turns out to be an incredibly enlightened person, I think. I mean, obviously, he, as you would expect, he's Orthodox, but he's actively engaged collaboration with the reform and progressive movements of Judaism in Poland, and is a very popular figure and has been really part of the sort of revival of Jewish life in specifically Warsaw and Krakow, which are the two main centers, but other places too. I then spent the day doing a whole tour of the whole Warsaw Ghetto remains. This was a fragment. There's not much of the actual wall left, but there are a few fragments of the wall. But other than that, you see mostly, this is the only remaining building that was actually, can someone, I'm going to mute you. I see where that noise is coming from. I can't. Okay. This is, yes, and it may even not exist anymore. Someone's trying to get in. Are you monitoring, Joy, are you monitoring the waiting room? Because there are people trying to get in. Okay. Sorry, I love technology. This building may not exist anymore, but this is the only remaining building at the time that actually stood in the Warsaw Ghetto. And what you see all around the boundary of the Warsaw Ghetto is this, which has 1940 to 1943, and it marks the actual place where the ghetto war was. I'm not going to go into the whole history of the Warsaw Ghetto. I'm sure some of you know more about it than I do. It was a brutal ghetto. There was a lot of starvation, disease, and degradation, and a lot of people died within those walls. What's kind of horrifying is that what was the inside of the Warsaw Ghetto is just part of modern day Warsaw, and people just live there, you know, in perhaps knowing, perhaps not knowing what really happened in there. Within the ghetto is this memorial to the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. Again, I'm not going to go into the history. This is more about a personal story. This part of the ghetto was incredibly moving to me. This is called Umschlagplatz, which is where the Jews went through a passage, and the Nazis built a train platform right at the gates of the ghetto, and the Jews went onto the trains and went straight to Treblinka, where most of them went to their death. I don't know if you can read this, but it says, along this path of suffering and death, over 300,000 Jews were driven in 1942 to 1943 from the Warsaw Ghetto to the gas chambers of the Nazi extermination camps. And this is the actual, yeah, well, that's the same sign, but this is the pathway that they walked through, and where they boarded the trains. The old Jewish cemetery is just outside the walls of the ghetto, and there are some incredibly old graves, because there's you know, a 1,000-year history of the Jews of Poland. So there's very old graves, as well as this, which is where 80,000 Jews who died of disease and hunger inside the ghetto were buried. And there's also this, which is, all these are symbolic graves of the people who died in the Holocaust. You can see it says in Polish and Hebrew and English that they're symbolic graves of Holocaust victims. I was very moved by this sculpture of Janusz Korczak. I'm sure many of you have heard his incredible story. He was a beautiful and passionate educator of Jewish children, and he was given a chance to save his own life, but he refused to leave his children. He went with the orphans and got on a train in 1942 to Treblinka, where he died. So that's just seeing that, having known the story of Janusz Korczak for quite a long time, and then seeing that memorial was just really incredibly moving to me, and inside that cemetery of the Warsaw Ghetto. I'm not going to offer commentary to that. You can read it for yourselves. It has its own commentary. The Pollen Museum, I ended up staying an extra day in Warsaw, actually, because it was closed the day I was there, and I really did not want to leave Warsaw without going to the Pollen Museum. It tells the story of 1,000 years of Polish Jewish history. There's a midrash, which Polin is the Hebrew name for Poland, but there's a sort of midrash that says that Polin means here we will dwell. And the early Jews who settled in Poland thought it was going to be a place of great safety and success and integration. And, you know, again, I'm so not a historian, but some of the history was really, there were lots of established communities and integrated communities. Of course, there were all the things that we know about, and culminating with the Holocaust and the fact that so many Poles did die in the Holocaust. But the the sort of narrative arc, I used that same term for the Legacy Museum of the Pollen Museum, is that it just tells that whole story of 1,000 years of history of Jews in Poland. And of course, it culminates with the Holocaust exhibit, which is very, very moving and powerful. And I think one of the most stirring pieces that I saw in it was you sit in like a tram car of what the Poles would have, and the trams were going right through the, as you may know, the Warsaw Ghetto was divided into two parts. There was the larger ghetto and the smaller ghetto, and there was a wooden bridge that went between the two, that the Jews would walk back and forth. But underneath, the Polish people were just driving along, riding along in the trams, and they could see out of the windows. And there's this very powerful exhibit in this museum that you sit in a tram car, and the windows show you what you could have seen, and sort of invites you to consider how the Poles may have reacted or not reacted to what they were seeing. So, but the actual, again, the arc of the museum, the narrative arc of the museum, that doesn't end there. You then go out, and there's this very, very brightly lit room with a huge screen showing like the revival of Jewish life in Poland today. It's a very hopeful, but I'll say more about it when I talk about Krakow, but there's just this sort of like brightness to it that shows like all of the klezmer festivals that happen in Krakow, and shows the sort of the revival of Jewish religious life. But I think it's a little bit exaggerated in my view. There is definitely a cultural regeneration of Jewish life in Poland, but it can never get out of the shadows of the history there, and the fact that so many millions of people, including many children, were killed, even if they weren't themselves Polish nationals. Poland, and we know the awful history of contemporary Polish government trying to write itself out of the history and say they weren't complicit in the Holocaust, but we know that's not true. And even though, of course, it was a Nazi machine, the fact that so many of the concentration camps were in Poland is not something that we can ignore. Even though I met some amazing Poles, which I'll tell you more about. That's the mezuzah on the outside of the Pollen Museum. Warsaw is worth visiting. So I went to, I got a train from Warsaw. I thought I had a picture in here of the train station in Warsaw where I boarded the train. But I got a train from Warsaw to Krakow. And that train journey was really stirring to me, because I remember Irene Rosenstein telling the stories as they were on the cattle cars going to Auschwitz, where they would look out the cracks in the window, and they'd see these Polish peasants who were going like that, not sort of looking with eyes of compassion, but looking with sort of eyes of knowing that they were going to their deaths. And Irene, that was so upsetting part of Irene's story when she would tell her story, her Holocaust story. But so when I was sitting on a train on the way from Warsaw to Krakow, knowing that the following morning I was going to be going to Auschwitz, I wrote this while I was on that train. It's just called On the Train from Warsaw to Krakow. On a train, a Jew watching the Polish forests flying past the window in silent knowing, as if their deep roots and dying leaves have never stopped holding memory and telling stories. Hard to push away images of Jews in cattle cars, seeing the same landscapes on a forced journey to their deaths. Or the Poles watching indifferently, perhaps, seeing through their tram windows a people brutalized, dehumanized. Did these farms and houses now hiding in the sunset once hide Jews? Do the homes from which they were chased still stand as witnesses? Are there remains of burned synagogues amidst these quickly passing villages? Any remnants of that vibrant lost world? I try to imagine what thoughts beyond how long will it be until death greets me, pierced into the minds of these terrified, humiliated ones crammed into cars like animals. As I find myself, outrageously, irritated by neighbors' legs too close to mine, or the conversations around me in a language I don't understand. I wake myself up to remember the horrors of those trains as mine pulls gracefully into Krakow, where a hotel room and a clean bed await me. So Bartek, my Warsaw guide, connected me with Lukasz, a young Pole who, like Bartek, recently discovered that one of his grandfathers was Jewish. And he picked me up at 5 o'clock in the morning from my hotel in Krakow to drive me to Auschwitz. And this was on the road in that early morning. Bartek also organized for Pavel, who is an extraordinary, brilliant historian and guide at Auschwitz. He actually arranged for him to meet me before the museum opened to the public. This is the sign, and just seeing the road sign that says Auschwitzim, which is the Polish name for Auschwitz, just was incredibly stirring to me as I was on that pre-dawn or pre-sunrise car ride. And then we got to Auschwitz, and as I said, Pavel got me in before the Auschwitz was open to the public. So I went in right as the sun was rising, and you can see there the sun rising over the Arbeit macht frei sign that takes you into Auschwitz I. And there was something I always imagined, because this was the first time I'd been to Auschwitz, I always imagined if I went there for the first time, it would be with a large group. And there was something about being there, just me and a guide, with no one else there, because there are thousands and thousands of visitors in the course of a day and a week and a month and a year in Auschwitz. But just walking through in that early morning light was extraordinary. Some of you who've been will know that there is Auschwitz I and Auschwitz II, which are about half a mile away from each other. And Auschwitz II is also known as Birkenau, which is where the second phase of the final solution was really carried out, where the gas chambers and the crematorium were, although there were early gas chambers here in Auschwitz I, but they're very different in feel. I spent some time walking around with my guide Pavel, and again, Lukasz, Pavel, Bartek, all non-Jewish Poles who were just committed to telling the stories, committed to getting to know Jews. Lukasz felt this incredible sense of privilege. He spent the whole day with me. I tried to pay him. He wouldn't. Not only would he not take money, he wanted to take me out for dinner at the end of a very, very long day, because he felt like it was such a privilege for him to take a rabbi around Auschwitz. And I'll tell you more stories about that in a moment. But as you go through Auschwitz I, which is basically a museum that tells the story that many of you know, and you get to see these signs that just giving you the grim numbers of what happened in these walls, and lots of the images which will be familiar to some of you. These are people who've just got off the trains, and these are women and children who almost certainly weren't going straight to the gas chambers. And then you have these exhibits, which I just found so incredibly moving, because you see here all of the pots and pans. People, as they left, then they were given, in some cases, not very long to gather all their things and get onto the transports, onto the trains, and they gathered things and they didn't know, and they thought maybe they were going to be resettled somewhere else. And they took their pots and their pans, and what you can see that just so moved me is that they're red, white, and blue, which was for those who kept kosher homes. There would have been meat, dairy, and parva items that they would have scrambled to take with them, thinking they were going to be able to cook, but they were immediately confiscated and put into what was known as Canada as soon as they got there. And all of the cases that they carried their possessions in with their names written on them, that were also just immediately confiscated. And of course, the images of the shoes, which I'm sure many of you have seen these pictures before. And there are display case after display case of things like this that just touch the heart so very deeply. while I was there, they had just opened this exhibit, which I don't think is there anymore, of this French artist called David Olaire, who was a Sonderkommando. The Sonderkommandos were the grimmest thing. They were themselves mostly Jewish prisoners who were actually given the special and very grim duty of putting the dead bodies from the gas chambers into the crematoria. And David Olaire was this brilliant artist who obviously was incredibly traumatized by his experiences, and he recorded them through art. And actually, some historians have used his artwork. Some of it's extremely graphic and expressionistic, but some of it is painting portraits that people didn't have before about what was happening in the crematoria and so on. And so there was an exhibition of his paintings that was in Auschwitz I when I was there, that we walked around. And I have a book of his artwork, which is kind of mind-blowing, really. And then my guide drove me actually in his car to Auschwitz II, to Birkenau, and he showed me a few of the pointers, and then he had to go and do something else, and he just left me there. And I was then there for, I don't know, 8 hours, 10 hours. Time kind of stood still for me. I was there certainly from close after sunrise until sunset on that November day. So it was many, many hours. And this was a reconstruction of what the barracks in Auschwitz II looked like. You can see the train tracks that went straight into where the camp was constructed of Birkenau. And these are the rubble of what were the many, many, many barracks where people were kept in the most awful situations. And this picture just gives you perspective and scale of just how massive Birkenau is, just a massive, massive area. And this is block 19 of the sea lager of Birkenau. I said to my guide Pavel, I said, whatever else you show me, please take me to block 19 of the sea lager. Because this, I heard Irene, whenever I heard her tell her story, this is where she was. And she would say it was like this, almost like this mantra, block 19, a sea lager, Birkenau, Auschwitz-Birkenau. And some of you never had the incredible privilege to meet Irene, but her stories are really amazing. But she and her 3 sisters, Fege, Esther, and Haichu, and Irene, also known as Ilona, they all survived Auschwitz, all 4 of them. They became known as die vier Schwester, the 4 sisters in Yiddish, and people just loved them. And they were given a tip-off one day that Block 19 was going to be liquidated, and someone helped them escape into, here's another perspective of Block 19, someone helped them escape into the adjacent block here, which is block 17. And just because of that act of kindness towards these 4 sisters, they survived, whereas no one else in their block did that day. And I spent about, I don't know, maybe 2 hours just sitting in the rubble of block 19. And I was crying, and I was singing, and I was praying, and I was writing. And this is one of the things that I wrote while I was there. Sitting on moss and rubble and dirt, with rusty tins of old memorial candles and an eerie silence loud in its lie, another horrific deception in this hell that greeted its new arrivals with the agonizing myth of hope to prevent panic, where so many went straight to horrific death, old men, women, mothers and grandmothers and children whose innocent faces are captured on those last ever photos taken as they got off the trains. Others came to these barracks where I sit now, crammed into wooden bunks, sharing way too few open latrines, where the human stench mingled with the smell of fear, despair, and suffocating ash, where the sky was always red. Irene and her sisters were saved from this hallowed hellhole ground by a miracle, by kindness, by who knows what, in their escape from 19 to 17, spared by moments from gas and fire, a fate emerging from a chimney. And now I see a small herd of small deer scuttling through these ruins with a redeeming grace for an unredeemable past. The brick chimneys still stand in these barracks, attached to furnaces that did not provide enough heat in those bleak, starved winters, while the other chimneys efficiently pumped human ashes into the heavens. A strong sun reflects in the rubble and on the hundreds of visitors scattered all over the camp, mocked into insignificance by how many prisoners, living and dead, passed through this evil machine. Polish school children, Israelis whose existential story depends on this, and the blue and white flags drape around the narratives not quite fitting. The Zen Peacemakers sitting circled on the platform by the tracks, different faiths meditating for the peace of these souls and an end to our endless capacity for violence, for dehumanization. So many bricks, so many untold stories under the score of sweet bird song, nature's psalm for the agony of this place. Part of me cannot leave, needing somehow to stay here forever, and another pulls me to get away, to never come back, to wash death away from my body, from my heart. I must go, and before I do, I try to imagine the beautiful young woman that I knew as a loving, old, and still beautiful woman in this exact place where her courage and valor and hope and love smothered her fear and saved her from hell. May my precious moments of presence here honor those who lived and died and suffered in this makom. May their souls, housed in bodies that were so tortured, be at peace in an eternal embrace beyond place. I'm just going to scroll through some of these without commentary for a minute because I don't have words right now. You can see the captions, you can see what they are. And yes, there are many high school groups and Israeli soldier groups that come daily, I think, to visit Auschwitz. And they have their experience and they have their ceremonies. This gentleman here was an Auschwitz survivor who comes, I think, 4 or 5 times a year from Israel to accompany high school students and tell part of his story as they have a tekes, a ceremony there. I actually really, when I was there, I decided I really wanted to say Kaddish for Irene in that place. And I was there on my own, as you know, and early in the morning, there weren't that many people there. And this was a secular Israeli high school group. And at one point I just, I went up to one of their teachers and I said, you know, I'd really like to say Kaddish. Do you think you could help me and just get a minyan together? And immediately, it was so moving. Immediately, like all these secular high school boys showed up. Suddenly a kippah came out of their pocket. They put it on their head and they joined with me. And I said, no, I count men and women in my minyan. And they came and we had a minyan and I just talked about Irene and I said Kaddish with a group of Israeli high school students, which felt like a powerful memory for me. And a lot of the signs are in, you know, multiple languages, but this is Polish, German, Yiddish, and Hebrew. I had known about the Zen Peacemakers, Bernie Glassman, who a Jewish Zen Buddhist practitioner, would have fit right into Boulder. I'm sure he had come here. I'm sure he was close to Reb Zalman, but he started many years ago the Zen Peacemakers, who come every year to Auschwitz and just sit by the tracks. And I had wondered if that was going to be the first time I would be in Auschwitz, was to join them. And a friend and I had talked about that possibility. And I had absolutely no idea that the day I was there happened to be one of the 2 days that they also were there. And as I approached them and just saw this circle of international, interfaith people sitting and meditating by the tracks, I'm walking up there and suddenly someone jumps out of the circle and says, "Rabbi Marc!" And it was Shir Yaakov, now Rabbi Shir Yaakov, who some of you may have heard of. He's a recently ordained Jewish Renewal rabbi who's a very powerful composer of contemporary Jewish music too, and he has been very involved in this. Also, this happened just 3 or 4 days after Bernie Glassman had actually died, and so there's actually a picture of him in the middle of the circle, and they were there in his honor. But it was pretty powerful to see the group there. In that particular way of being in Auschwitz. You know, there's so many different ways that people mark that place, whether you're an Israeli high school student or someone of a different faith wanting to meditate for peace. There's just different ways to honor that experience. I can see that there are things coming in the chat, but I'm not looking at them. So if anyone else, if there's things that I really need to pay attention to, you know, we're nearly done with Auschwitz, and I'm going to take a pause and take a look. But this is, you can see the first picture of Auschwitz was the sun rising over the Arbeit macht frei sign, and this is the sun setting over the barracks of Birkenau. I spent the whole day there, and it was all to honor this beautiful woman. I'm just reading through the chat box here. Okay, they're all mostly private messages to me, which I may get into or may not, but the one that Shelley asks is, how does Poland feel now about the treatment of its Jews during the Holocaust? That's a very complicated question, and I have a complicated answer, which I'll get to when I talk about Krakow. But I'm not paying attention to time. I have a lot more I can say. I don't want to go over my time. On my calendar, this was scheduled till 2, but if it's only scheduled till 1 and people have to leave, they have to leave. You know, this could have been a 4-part presentation easily, but I don't know. Help. What shall I do? Joy, shall I just carry on?
Yes, please carry on. We, you know, trust you to share as much as you feel is appropriate today, and I think I know I am fully engaged on this journey with you and love to hear more.
Okay. Well, I think I'll read, there's just one more very short piece that I wrote also from that same place that was to Irene, seeing as you can see her picture there now. I said, Irene, I sit on the ground in the rubble of Block 19, whose number I heard you say so many times, Sea Lager, Block 19, Birkenau. A gruesome address mythologically imprinted in my mind. And now I sit with Block 17 to my left, where you and your sisters fled just before the others went to the gas chambers, saved once again from the grip of the angel of death, surviving to tell the tale. How can I redeem the souls of the women who were crammed in here, who died so horrifically? And now you have left the world too. Silence and prayer. The peace of this place is surprising and overwhelming. May your soul and their souls be at peace too. Part of the answer to Shelley's question is my guide Lukasz, who just was not only just waiting for me while he just gave me absolute space to spend as many hours I wanted in Birkenau. What I didn't know is that while I was in Birkenau, he was doing some research and going around in the town of Auschwitz, which is the Polish name for Auschwitz, but it's still a fairly large town that was just outside where the camp is. And he got the keys to the old Jewish cemetery in Auschwitz and took me to the grave, this grave of the last Jew in Auschwitz, Shimshon Kluger. Now, Shimshon Kluger's story is just remarkable. He grew up in the town of Auschwitz. He was in Auschwitz. He survived Auschwitz. And when he was liberated, he refused to leave Auschwitz. And he went back into the town and lived there until he died in the 1970s. And all of his family moved to America and Sweden and other places. And they begged him to leave Auschwitz and he wouldn't. And so he's known as the last Jew in Auschwitz. And Lukasz, who, as I said, was just all he wanted to do was get to know Jews. When we got back to Krakow, he asked me what I was going to be doing over Shabbat. He wanted to come and have Shabbat dinner with me. He wanted to come to the synagogue and pray with me. He came to all these different, had these different experiences with me. The home of the Klugers is now called Cafe Auschwitz, and it's a vegetarian cafe in the old home, and also a little Jewish museum that someone who I actually spent Shabbat with, Professor Jonathan Weber and his wife Connie Weber, who live and have lived for many years in Krakow. He was one of the main people, a brilliant scholar and academic. They both are. Connie Weber is actually the editor-in-chief of the Litkin, no, what's it called? Paul, you'll know, it's a whole massive library of Polish Jewish history archives, the something library, the Littman Library. She's the editor-in-chief, and they live in Krakow. And Jonathan Weber has managed to, through amazing intuition and research, uncover a lot of the old sites of synagogues. And he, just next to this home of the Klugers, he actually found through intuition what was the old synagogue in Auschwitz. And remember, we're like less than a mile from where Auschwitz is right now. And here's the synagogue that Jonathan Weber restored. And here is the reconstructed synagogue. And I, after spending that whole day, and it was close to the end of the day by now in Auschwitz, decided to daven mincha, to pray the afternoon service in this actual spot. I was standing right at that bima in the middle there, and prayed mincha as I was thinking of Irene and all of the other people who both died and survived Auschwitz. And this is now back in Krakow. And I'm not sure how much I want to talk about Krakow, except to just whiz through a few slides. I mean, there is this cemetery goes back to 1535, the old cemetery in Krakow, and it's right next to the Ramu synagogue. The Ramu is actually, they call him the Ramu in Poland, but really we know him as the Ramah. Rabbi Moshe Isserl is a very important figure in Jewish law, in halacha, who's buried in this cemetery. But this cemetery right next to that synagogue just has some remarkable graves in it. There's the grave of the Ramah, and here is the grave of Rabbi Yoel Serkos, very important figures in rabbinic history, but I'm not going to tell you their stories. And then here is the ghetto, the ghetto that was in Krakow, which is marked with the symbolic big chairs. And then there are these amazing synagogues, the Temple Synagogue, which you can see was really kind of an early Reform synagogue, the Association of Progressive Jews as an Enlightenment temple. But it's a very beautiful interior, as you can see. and you have to pay to get, oh, we're not ready for Berlin. You have to pay to get into all of these synagogues, which I had some strange feelings about. Auschwitz was, that whole day was a Thursday, and then I spent the day in Krakow on Friday, and then I spent Shabbat there. And I had Friday night dinner in the Krakow JCC, where they have a Shabbat dinner every week, which is quite a lot of people there, many of whom are Poles who are not Jewish, who are craving to know more about Judaism, which again is part of that answer to that question. There are a lot of young Poles, especially young Poles, who either have found out that they had a Jewish ancestor, or just have their own trauma about the disappearance of a third of the population, right? So I went on Friday night, and I was actually asked to speak at that dinner as well as in a service before. And then I actually went to 3 different services that Friday night. 2 Orthodox and 1 Reform, that started at slightly different times, and Lukasz wanted to be at all of them. And the experience of being in Krakow for Shabbat was amazing, really, and brought up a lot of feelings too. There were hundreds and hundreds of Jewish groups, mostly very religious groups. There was a group of very religious Israeli high school students, young women, and then there was a group of mostly American high schoolers, Orthodox, who were on a year program in Israel, and they had come to Krakow and to Auschwitz. And there's this a lot of very strange feelings. So after Shabbat in Krakow, I sat and I was just reflecting on the whole experience, and I wrote this piece that I think speaks to some of my experience. It's called Saturday Night in Krakow. And by the way, it just happened to be on the 100th anniversary of Polish independence that I was there, 10th of November 2018. Here they have cheder and chevre and chamsa, bars, cafes and restaurants. The locals pronounce it ch like cheese, cheddar, rather than Hebrew or Yiddish for a room, a gathering space, a school. I wandered across the square for services in the ancient synagogue of the Ramah, they call him the Ramu here, as Shabbat was beginning. Every restaurant is serving some kind of Jewish food, and the klezmer musicians play popular Israeli tunes and classic Yiddish melodies with menorahs on tables behind them. Here there were once dozens of synagogues, and this square would have been buzzing with hundreds of Jews excitedly going to meet the Sabbath bride and bring her into their grasp after another hard week to taste that bliss. Now those magnificent old shuls cost 10 zlotys to enter, to peep into the past, stops on the tourist trail, and now the throngs of former worshippers are sad oddities of a forgotten world as Jewish life is consigned to a museum, a theme park. As I take my Shabbat walk, kippah-headed through the square, I wonder if I will hear, "Look, look, there's a Jew!" And then I encounter a large group of young Israeli women dressed for Shabbat and singing, and we wish each other Shabbat Shalom. In the shul, the familiar psalms are chanted to transition out of another week, and we are a few short of a minyan until another large group of American high schoolers studying in Israel arrives, bubbling over with spirit and ready to take over, and we sing and dance with joy as I wonder what the small group of local Jews make of all this. Oh, another group come to save us, to redeem themselves from the past, to heal our ancestral wounds that are still open and festering really after all these years. I don't know if we are offering balm and bandages or salt. And oh, this place is so complex and we are so broken, and thank God for Shabbat and the possibility of connection through a deep shared language of prayer and ritual that can never be understood by this cultural voyeurism of borscht, kugel and klezmer. And as I have these thoughts, I learn about all the Poles who are yearning to know more about this Jewish people, this people that were once a third of their people, and that so many of them have a Jewish grandparent, but they didn't know until now. And they too need to heal the past. And this is part of that. And we cannot join that cynical chorus of, but all Poles still want to kill us, don't they? They always have. They don't. Most of them didn't then, even though it's an easier way to tell that story, eliminating its nuance. There is no future without sharing a different story. The people I meet know so much more than I ever will about this 1,000-year entwined history on this 100th anniversary of independence. They tell tales of goodness, of kindness. So who am I to say there is none? So Krakow, you know, I was there in November. In the summer, it's like a hotbed of Klezmer Fest, and people, Jews and non-Jews from all over the world, gather there, and they have this cultural festival. I've heard it's amazing and wonderful, but I just couldn't help being a little bit cynical about it. It feels a bit kitschy, a bit of a nod to a lost past. But I was also, you know, I've just moved in so many different ways, and I think I was very moved by the stories I heard from Professor Jonathan Weber, who I've already mentioned, who has just got to, you know, speaks fluent Polish and knows and loves Poles and loves Poland, and just feels like there's a very convenient narrative that says the Poles hate us, and that there are lots of stories, lots and lots of stories of Poles who, past, present, and future, are willing to be part of a different narrative. And I don't, you know, I don't want to gloss over the fact that yes, there were basically pogroms that happened after the Holocaust was over. There were Poles who massacred survivors as they got back to their hometowns. There were some awful things that happened, but there were also, you know, hundreds of thousands of Poles who risked their lives. There were, you know, the number of people who were honored as righteous Gentiles, Poles who hid Jewish children, Poles who, you know, just were killed for being complicit in Jewish survival. That's part of the story too. Yeah. I mean, the next part of the story is really Berlin and Prague. And I don't know. I feel like I want to take the temperature and see whether I can do that a lot quicker than this, whether we want to go through some Berlin and Prague. One of the main reasons I want to is because, like, I feel like this was an honoring of Irene. I also want to honor Doris, who grew up in Berlin. But should I just keep going? Should we pause for a bit, see if there's anyone wants to say anything? I don't know. Very hard to read a room when you're not in a room. You're in a Zoom room. How do you read the room when the room is a Zoom room?
I would say continue.
All right, I'll continue. I'm carrying on, and I'm going to take you straight. I went with my good friend Micah, who right now, every single day, is delivering between 300 and 400 meals to frontline National Health Service workers and homeless people in London. And he and I went and had 3 days in Berlin, actually 2 days in Berlin together. And of course, our tour started at the Brandenburg Gate, which it's so easy to sort of close your eyes and see swastikas hanging down from this gate because that's such an iconic image. But modern day Berlin is very different, but also a complex place with a complex history. We toured around. It's so weird and interesting, you know, the comparative narratives of the walls of the Warsaw Ghetto and the walls of the Berlin Wall, and then the Holocaust Memorial in Berlin, which, as I said, is the Peace and Justice Memorial in Montgomery, Alabama, is modeled after it, with all of these slabs of different shapes and sizes there in the memorial, very stark concrete. But this is Straßburger Straße 36, apartment 11, which was where Doris Small grew up, and I was really only a few days before I got there. someone had provided me with information that had the address that she grew up. So I was delighted to be able to take, our guide was, Dickel was an Israeli who's doing a PhD lives in Berlin. We had an amazing Shabbat in Berlin, lots of vibrant Jewish life in Berlin now, but you know, there's also a lot of anti-Semitism. I mean, you have to be careful. You're advised not to wear a kippah in the streets of Berlin, even though in some ways it's an enlightened city and there's lots of Jewish life. And to, you know, if we think we got issues which we have with security here, I mean, to even go into a synagogue, you have to go through like airport type security. There are, you know, armed police officers at every entrance of every shul. You go through a metal detector. They ask you all kinds of questions. They interrogate you. There are Israeli local police as well as Israelis. I mean, it's extraordinary. But this is the apartment building, presumably been greatly refurbished since Doris lived there. And that's me standing outside her door. Doris and her husband Martin moved to Boulder just a little bit before I did, in 2003 or 2004. They both, she'd escaped Berlin. Martin was a Holocaust survivor who was in Mauthausen concentration camp, and they were very, very important members of B'nai Shalom and of the Boulder Jewish community, both telling their stories on many occasions. So here it is, Straßburger Straße. And then she used to talk about the Reicherstrasse, which was where I think, as far as I can work out, is where Doris would have gone to school. It was a Jewish school that she went, and she'd have many stories about talking about her Jewish school. That's the building. And she used to tell this is the inside of the synagogue. And Doris, those of you who ever heard her tell her story, her mother was bedridden from a very early age. She had a terrible accident, falling down 3 flights of stairs, and was bedridden. And so Doris really, as a young girl, never knew mother. And then she died. And then her father got very sick, and he died. And there were her and her sister and her older brother, Aaron. And Aaron was saying Kaddish every day for his father. And I think this may have been where he said Kaddish. I don't know for sure, but it's just around the corner from where Doris was, where they grew up. And then he came home from Minyan one day, and the Gestapo were there waiting for him, and they took him away. And that was the last time Doris and her sister saw her brother. And then it's a long story. They ended up then being thrown out of the apartment because they were minors, and they were on the streets of Berlin during Kristallnacht. And eventually they managed to, or Doris at least managed to get onto the Kindertransport, which took her to London. And she never had very positive things to say about her time in London. It was always a joke between us because, of course, it's where I grew up. This is the Iranian-Borges Synagogue, which was, the whole interior of it was destroyed during Kristallnacht, but you can see the amazing dome of the outside. And I did go there on Shabbat morning because they have right up on the 4th or 5th floor, there's a small a shul which is the Masorti, which is like the equivalent in Europe of the conservative movement, where they have a minyan there, where I actually ended up leading part of the service there. But you can see here it says, diese Synagoge, the synagogue ist 100 Jahre alt, 100 years old, und werde am 9th November 1938, I think it was basically destroyed in Kristallnacht in 1938. And here is the memorial to, this is at Friedrichstraße Bahnhof, one of 2 big stations in central Berlin. And there's a memorial here to the Kindertransport. Interestingly, the same sculptor, there's a memorial at Liverpool Street Station in London, which is where the trains ended up for the Kindertransport children who went to London. Over 10,000 children were rescued through the Kindertransport program, and you'll see, if you're still here, the equivalent story in Prague. but this is in Berlin, right outside the station where they set off. And there's a thing here that says, Zuge in das Leben, Zuge in den Tod. Trains for life, trains for death. Because trains, and that was why I had such a visceral experience when I was on that train from Warsaw to Krakow. And then I got a train, you'll see, from the Hauptbahnhof, from the main train station from Krakow to Prague. There's something about trains that are, you know, they're journeys that can save, and they're journeys that for so much Jewish memory is about death too. But here's Trains to Life, which is the whole story of the Kindertransport, and here's Trains to Death, which is about the transports to the concentration camps. So Doris, there's Doris, born July 20th, 1923 in Berlin, died September 3rd, 2018 in Boulder. And that's her with her husband, Martin. And so really my whole trip to Berlin, apart from seeing the modern city and getting to see the sights, was really to honor her. And I was so grateful to be able to go to the place of her childhood. And so here is the Hauptbahnhof, the main train station. And this is where I boarded a train from Berlin to Prague, and very beautiful views outside the train window. And then the first thing literally I saw when I got off the train in Prague was this memorial to the Czech Kindertransport. And some of you may have heard the extraordinary story of Sir Nicholas Winton, who was a very quiet, modest English stockbroker who really privately, even his wife didn't really know about it. So I always get so moved when I tell his story, because his wife just found, like, when he was already in his 80s or even 90s, just found in the attic all of these papers. And she said, "What are these?" And he said, "Oh, just something I did during the war." Sorry. And he saved 669 children. And he became a bit of a celebrity in England, because there was this Jewish TV personality in England called Esther Ranson, who sort of uncovered the story. And really worth looking on YouTube and finding the clip. It's so moving. She filled a whole live television audience with survivors and descendants of survivors from the Czech Kindertransport. And he was in the audience, not knowing that. And then she just tells a story. And then she says, "Would anybody whose life was saved because of Sir Nicholas Winton stand up?" And the whole TV studio stands up. And just a very, he died in 2015. And the hands represent the hands of parents saying goodbye for the last time to their children, almost certainly knowing that they were not going to see their children again. One of the things that always moved me about Doris Small's story was that she used to say her best friend Fritzi, who she grew up with, she saw her and her mother when they got on the train in Berlin on the Kindertransport. And as she saw her friend saying goodbye to her mother, she remembered, and she was 14 years old. She said she remembers saying, "Thank God my mother's dead already, so she doesn't have to go through this." So I don't really read Czech like I read German, but basically this is a farewell memorial. That's what the memorial is called. And then, yeah, a symbol of the courage and love of parents who in 1938 and 1939 put their children onto those trains. It was just very powerful for me, having seen the memorial to the Kindertransport in Berlin, and then getting on that train and just seeing that. I didn't know it was going to be there. Literally, I got off the train and walked off the platform and just saw it there, this memorial. So it was a very moving part of my journey. Theresienstadt. I don't have the emotional energy to go through all these stories, but Theresienstadt, as you probably know, was really an incredible propaganda tool for the Nazis. These washrooms probably were never ever used as washrooms. They created all of this fake imagery so that when the International Red Cross came to visit, they could say, look, we treat our Jews very well. And it was a pretty brutal place. This is an execution wall, a swimming pool where the Nazi officers would enjoy the warm summer days in luxury. The villa where the officers, Nazi officers, lived. And this is the, I found this very powerful. This is actually the cinema that was built specifically to show films to the International Red Cross and others who visited, to show how well everyone was treated, which was a total lie. And you sit in the cinema and you see some of the original footage of those films. Obviously a big Jewish memorial outside the gates. I took out the slides of because Theresienstadt was both a ghetto and a concentration camp. Terezin is the Czech name and Theresienstadt was the German name. A lot of people prefer to call it Terezin and not Theresienstadt because of not wanting to give it the power of the German name. So Terezin is the Czech name. But here's a memorial stone outside the crematorium, and here is the crematorium. Enough said. So the journey ended with a few days in Prague. Prague, some of you probably know, there's the Jewish Museum of Prague is basically you buy a ticket and it gives you entrance to all of these buildings. This is the Hebrei Kadisha building, which is where the traditional Jewish burial society and the various synagogues and the mikveh. This is the famous Altneu Shul, where the Maharal of Prague was the rabbi. Very extraordinary looking building. And really all of these shuls are so perfectly preserved, and it was really part of Hitler's vision to preserve Prague as a museum of the extinct Jewish race. I'm sure some of you know that piece of grim history, but that's part of why you see such incredible preservation of these shuls. And I'll just sort of scroll through some of them. And the Pinkas synagogue has names of the camps and the ghettos on the side of the ark, which is pretty powerful. And again, a 15th century cemetery in Prague. Prague again has an incredible Jewish history. I'm sure some of you have been there, but this is the grave of the Maharal, Rabbi Yehuda Loew. The lion, the image of the lion, which is connected to him. This is a minyan I went to in Prague with Chabad. Chabad's lineage goes back to the Maharal of Prague, so there's a lot of Chabad activity in Prague. And then it's a beautiful city, as those of you who visited know, walking across the Charles Bridge and going to the John Lennon pub and seeing the cathedral, which was became the Nazi headquarters during the war. And we're going to very quickly tell the story of one of the worst, Reinhold Heydrich, one of the worst Nazis of them all, who was based inside the Prague castle. 1942. One of my closest friends in London, John Boyd, who's a historian, and he happened to be in Prague while I was there, giving a talk to the Czech Parliament about anti-Semitism, and he said, "I've got the whole of Wednesday morning free if you want to meet up." And I said, "I do." So I walked across the Charles Bridge and I met him in his hotel, the other side of the river to the Jewish quarter where I was, and he said, "What are your plans?" I said, "I want you to show me something interesting." He said, "Great, let's go to church." And we get to this church, and in mosaic on the sidewalk there, it says 1942. And the church is the church of Saint Cyril and Methodius, which was a hiding place for the heroes of Operation Anthropoid, which was this assassination attempt of Obergruppenführer Reinhard Heydrich, who was an absolute evil monster who orchestrated. He was the head of operations for the Nazis in the whole of Moravia and Bohemia, and centered in Prague. And these two paratroopers, Czech paratroopers, Josef Gabčík and Jan Kubis, are absolute national heroes. And this is part of the story that I found so fascinating too, is like every Czech school child has heard these two names as heroes because they tried to overthrow the Nazi regime. And again, you can think, well, were the Czech people complicit? Did the Czech people hate Jews? Do the Czech people today hate Jews? There was a lot of people in what was then Czechoslovakia absolutely hated the Nazis, and they celebrated any attempt to overthrow them. So going to this particular church, and this is the crypt where they hid out, as well as Skopchik and Kubis. There were, I think, 7 other paratroopers who hid there, and eventually one of their own people tipped them off to the Nazis, and the Nazis got the fire department to come and flood out the crypt of the church with fire hoses and shot machine. You can see that actually the holes where the machine gun fire came through into the crypt, and they actually all had cyanide pills, and I think they all took their own lives rather than be killed by the Nazis. But none of them survived, but they are national heroes, and the whole of the crypt of the church is a museum to that particular part of history in 1942. The final place I went in Prague, which is the not outside the Jewish quarter, is the Jerusalem Synagogue of Prague, which has an amazing museum inside it too, and extraordinarily ornate insides. And no trip to Prague would be complete without a visit to the Franz Kafka Museum, which is where you see this beautiful sculpture of 2 men peeing, which is the last slide in my presentation. But that's it. I'm exhausted. I don't have more to say, but it's just something of that journey, October to November of 2018, in 4 extraordinary cities and 2 concentration camps, and well, the memories of those visits, which were all short. This was not a long period of time, will forever remain with me. So, thank you for listening. I'm happy to stay around if there are questions or comments that people want to ask. Yeah, so I'm going to take out the slideshow and see. I have no idea who's actually still here. Some people probably had to leave. But, so let me see what's in the chat box here. Oh, too late for that, Joy, but thank you. Yeah, I'm sure I could have worked out how to do that. Anyway, okay, there was no actual questions, there's just people's comments, so that's fine. But if anyone wants to, there's not that many people left. So if anyone wants to say anything, I don't know. I mean, Paul, it's an honor having you here. If there's anything that you wanted to share or correct me on any of the history or any of your own comments about contemporary Poland or Czech Republic, I don't know. I'm open to anything.
I can share real quickly just how powerful and moving of an experience that was, and how honored I feel to experience that journey with you through the eyes of a rabbi and an artist. And I'm really moved right now. I imagine everyone else might be feeling that same experience with their silence. Thank you.
Thank you. That was tremendously moving with your stories and your writings that you shared in the photos. It just makes me think, for good and bad, how can I live up to the legacy of being a human being? So much weight in history, and here we have the present.
Right.
Thank you so much. That was just very moving, and you must be exhausted. I'm drained.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting um, when you say the weight of human history. I mean, I was not anticipating in my sabbatical year, which was not, it wasn't a full year, it was well, about 5 months altogether, but I wasn't anticipating that this would become the main part of my sabbatical journey, seeing places of the absolute worst of humanity. I mean, just going, and I mean, it was grateful that the Alabama experience was part of it, you know. I mean,
Yeah.
in 2012, I got to go to Ghana and see the slave castle in Ghana on the Cape Coast, which is, you know, was just, that was the first time I'd really seen a place of such brutal human experience in that way. But yeah, but my mother's here from London. But she's trying to, because she didn't, you know, that's my mother Audrey. She just turned 80. And I think my sister might be here too, but I don't know. Anyway, but it's just it's an opportunity to share with people from far away when there's online stuff. Paul, did you have anything? I would be very curious if you have anything to share. Those of you who don't know Paul, he's a professor who knows way more about these things than I do. Are you speaking? Because you're muted. You're muted still.
How are we doing now?
I just unmuted you, Paul.
Okay, great. Just wanted to thank you, Marc, for sharing that journey with us. I think you did a wonderful job. In Poland, the pre-war population of Jews was concentrated in cities. So in the major cities like Warsaw, Lodz, you know, the population of Jews was 1/4 to 1/3 of the population. But overall in Poland, I believe the Jewish population was 10% of the total Polish population. This was the largest Jewish population in all of Europe, about 3,300,000 Jews. By the end of the war, there were only 300,000 Jews left. And then after the war, there was continuing anti-Semitism and the purges of Jews by the Soviets who ran Eastern Europe. So by the 1990s, the Jewish population of Poland was actually under 20,000 people, 20,000 Jews. So between the Nazis and the communists, Jewish population just almost vanished.
Well, certainly don't want to keep anyone here if people need to go, but you know, happy to be here a bit longer. Go ahead. I mean, if anyone has any, I do want to turn this into a book, and I don't quite know how to do that. So if anyone has any ideas or contacts or knowledge in that way, because I do. There's more. I mean, I didn't share all of my writing, but I just envisaged like a book with some of the images and on one side of the page a sort of narrative description of the journeys, and on the other side of the page the sort of spoken word pieces that I wrote while I was actually there with some of the images. But I don't know. Maybe it's a book. Maybe it's not.
Yeah. No. I hear. I'm just thinking about the idea of being a Jew on a train. Yeah. In Europe or in a specific area that you know, there's a history, and those are such powerful. And you conveyed that very powerfully. you know, the way the presentation stands today, I think there's capacity to grow that power. And the imagery, and so many of the writings, and also seeking out the early life places of two beloved older ones.
Yeah.
It's beautiful. Yeah.
Yeah, and as I said, if people want to see more of Irene, at 7 o'clock on next Tuesday, we're showing the film of her story, and just will be honoring her memory on her second yard site.
Rabbi Marc, I just want to thank you again. It was so powerful, and such an important story and history to share. And I think it was wonderful. I feel honored to be part of it and presenting it in Zoom. And I think it would be a wonderful book. And I wish we could all be in a room together. I miss that experience of being there together and, you know, holding each other in the space, because I feel a lot of emotion myself, and I imagine for everybody here. And I just thank you for your time.
Thank you. Next time we'll figure out the slideshow.
It was wonderful.
It was wonderful. I
Thank
hope you.
you.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here. Everyone be healthy and safe.
Thank you.
Thanks everybody. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Right.